Friends in a Podcast. We're so glad you're here. We're your hosts, Natasha and Lindsay. Have you seen the TikTok trend? It's kind of old now, but it's where people go out to a coffee shop and they have a conversation with their younger self.
Oh, yeah, I have seen that.
I really love that trend. But I'm not a social media person like that, so I would never do it. But I have thought about it a lot. So if you could take yourself out to coffee, your younger self, what would you say to yourself? And what age would you take yourself out?
Oh, goodness. That is a great. So those caveats there at the end kind of shifted a little bit. What age?
Well, you don't have
Uh,
to say what age if you're not sure.
yeah, I don't know if I have an age that like stands out. I mean, 15 kind of stands out to me, but at the same time, like, I don't know. I would say, wow, don't try so hard. And there's so many layers to this answer. I think I would warn against being too focused on the relationships of people that aren't invested in a reciprocal friendship. That was a hard one for me to learn. Um, Also, everything is going to work out, but you need to relax. um, and oh man, I think it would be a long conversation. I think it would be like, girl, you're going to go to therapy and it's going to be okay. And you didn't fail at life because you took that step. And you're not tied to what you do. So you should probably reorient how you do life because it's not all about that. Um, yeah, there's so many ways you could go with that conversation. What about you?
Yeah, that's hard. It sounds like yours would be a lot of like deconstructing ideas that you held on to just based on
Oh
viewpoints that
yeah,
you grew up around or lessons that were taught around you, those kind of things.
100%. I mean, that's been a lot of my adulthood for
Mm-hmm.
sure. Especially after becoming a parent. I feel like you start to view life a lot different when you're trying to figure out what you're going to pass on to your kids. And so, yeah, definitely deconstructing a lot of thoughts and thought processes, um, letting go of unhealthy things to make room for what is healthy and what is going to help move forward in life for sure.
Yeah, no, that's really good. Mine's tough. I thought about like what age I would take myself out a lot. I don't know why that felt significant to me as like at what age would I need to hear from my adult self, if that makes sense? Like,
Oh, that's a good point. Yeah.
when would I have received it or when was I at like my lowest point that it really could have helped me and walked me through some of the hard times. And I think in my teen years, I don't know that there's a specific age, but at 15, like you said, kind of came to mind for me as well. Um, but I think I would just tell myself, like, it's okay to breathe, just breathe and stop trying to figure it out and hold the hurt of everybody around you. And I had a pretty rocky childhood, and that was a lot for me to like process as an adult. And I think that I wish as a kid that I would have just focused more on being a kid than focusing on everyone around me is hurting or angry or whatever, and kind of walking through a life of turmoil all the time and always feeling mixed up inside. Um, and then I think I would just say, like, you got out. I always wanted to get out of like small town, move on, but I could never figure out like what that looked like. I, didn't want to go to like conventional college and do the college life. Like those kind of things just didn't interest me. And I thought, oh, I'm going to be stuck in this town working either as a CNA at the mill or at Walmart for the rest of my life because those were kind of the options in my town. So,
Wow. Yeah.
yeah.
Look
So,
at you. And like you're a
I
big time businesswoman now.
Well, I wouldn't say that, but I definitely have come a long way from where I thought I was going to be even at 18, leaving high school to where I am now, 20 years later. So
We don't have to say those things out loud.
I know. I'm coming to terms with it.
And that's okay. I
It's
was
fine.
just teasing. Um, I would also say that too. Like I had this when I was in high school, I didn't understand what it was at the moment. I thought it was very much similar to what you said about small town mentality. And so that's what I really thought it was. Because I always had this like inner, I don't want to use the word angst because that's not the right word, but like this inner feeling of there has to be more to life than what this town offers. And I never understood why everybody that I was surrounded with at the time was so content to stay in this town. And nothing against the town. It's lovely and there's lovely people there, and that's great. I didn't understand it and I didn't know what to like make sense of that. Like I didn't know how to make sense of that. And so when I left for school, I went to Massachusetts for school. And in my mind, like I was not going back to Maine. Like, see you later, peace out, good riddance. I'm not coming back. And I could have given you at the time a list as long as my arm of all the reasons why I would never live in Maine again. And life happened and here I am back in Maine. But I do love where I live and I am grateful that I get to raise my family here. But it does look very different than I thought it would.
Yeah, no, that's fair. The irony of wanting to leave small town where I grew up in Florida, I moved and now live in a very small Lur town in Maine. So that's ironic. However, I will say that that opportunity gave me so many opportunities to believe in myself, shed a lot of stuff that kept me from believing in my full potential, right? And unlocked a lot of potential. And I live in a small town. However, there are bigger cities around, whereas my town was kind of 45 minutes to the closest thing. So it made it a little harder. But also, whenever you have the idea that everybody has a perception of you, it's hard to like break that perception for yourself because you start to believe what you think other people think about you. And so then you kind of just like fall in that radar and it's hard to like push, at least for me, it was hard to push out of that until I moved at 20 away from there.
I can relate to that a lot because um, in the small town that I grew up in, there is a Bible school there. And that's where my parents went to Bible school. My uncle works at that school, and my grandfather had worked there for a time. So there was a lot of family ties to it. And initially, I thought that that's where I would end up going to school and kind of doing the family routine of this is the school that I go to and whatever. And thank the Lord, he had different plans for my life. But I also needed that space and that separation to be able to figure out who I was outside of those shadows. Because here, where I grew up, I was, known as the niece of the president of the school, or my mom, or my dad, or whoever it was, and that's all fine. But for me to figure out what I needed to do with my life, I needed to be removed from that. And so Bible school in Massachusetts, far away from all of this town, was that option for me. And I learned so many things in the 2 years that I was in Bible school, that I would never trade, like hands down. I would never trade that experience, to the point that I always recommend and encourage the kids in my life that I have the ability to speak to, and encourage them, even if it's just for a year or a semester, leave the town that you grew up in to go someplace else and figure out life outside of what you know, because you'll never regret it, because there's so much that happens when you are surrounded by different people in a different environment that I think is necessary. It's kind of a rite of passage almost to going on to that next stage of life.
I agree. We've talked about that before, and I 100% agree. You step out of your comfort zone and the familiar, and you figure out who you want to be and if the values that you grew up with were the values that you align with. And it's okay if they aren't 100% on par. once you start experiencing the world, as long as you're doing it with the right motivation and obviously the right values behind it. But yeah, I think we've touched, obviously, there's good that comes out of life and making changes and making things. But sometimes when you look back at life, it's not always. So I think on the flip side of that, having that conversation with my younger self also kind of made me think about all the things that I can't say to her as an adult. I can't go back to her and say, this looks like this or this looks like that. Are there things in your life that you feel like over the years you've had to grieve, that you thought this is the way life would look like, but really it doesn't look like that at all?
Yeah, there have been a lot of those. When I left Maine and was living in Massachusetts, my heart was and soul was in that city that I lived in. And I did grieve a lot when I left there. And I didn't leave for anything bad. I was leaving to get married. So it was a good thing. But there was still a big part of my heart that I left behind there. And I was not prepared for that level of grief. And I didn't even know it was grief. I genuinely had no words to describe what I was feeling. And at the time, I couldn't even said like that it was being depressed. Like I didn't have verbiage for any of what I was feeling. And that made it really difficult to make that transition because I went from living life on this high of everything is fantastic. I'm literally living a dream come true. And like, even on the hard days, I love what I'm doing because I know this is where I'm supposed to be. And to leave that and step into a different way of life, not doing any of the things that I had envisioned and also preparing to get married. So there's so many different life changes happening all at once that when you bottle that up into one experience happening at one after the other, there was a lot of grief. And I didn't know how to express that or how to process any of it. And unfortunately, it came out at my husband a lot. He wasn't my husband at the time, we were engaged. And it made me question our relationship quite a bit because I thought that all of these life changes that were making me feel so uncomfortable had to do with our relationship and not necessarily about the fact that I had just transitioned my entire trajectory of life in a matter of months. And it didn't look anything like I expected. And so it made it really difficult. And thank the Lord, we were able to kind of work through all of that. And it took a long time and it wasn't an easy process. It was a lot of really hard conversations, a lot of questioning, a lot of doubt, a lot of sadness. um, and so when I look back on that, I wish that I would have at least had the words to know what I was experiencing because I hadn't been surrounded by a lot of grief. And maybe I only understood grief to be when you lose somebody or something, right? Like I lost my grandfather when I was in my early 20s. And, like I experienced that kind of loss, but I hadn't experienced this kind of loss to understand what it was. Um, so, yeah, that was, I think, my first initial experience with walking through grief in a way that wasn't surrounded by like death necessarily.
Yeah, no, that's fair. I think mine was stepping away from ministry, and knowing that, like, I felt it in my bones, but deep down in my heart, like I felt it, that I knew that when I chose to walk away from serving full time in ministry, in a sense of like that was my job, not just I'm serving on a Sunday, that I wasn't going back to it. Like I just knew that that time in that season in my life was over. And coming to terms with that, because that's all I had known from the time I was 20 to about 28 years old, was full-time ministry and doing that. And the way that I deal with grief sometimes is I just fight or flight. So I flew home, literally drove my car to Florida, and decided to live there for a few months. Don't regret that time all the way. Have made some great memories and things like that, but I knew that it wasn't where I was supposed to be. And I think for those 8 months that I was there, it was like 8 months of continuing grief because I was miserable in the job that I was working. I hated it. I was working in healthcare as a front desk admin, and didn't enjoy that at all. And then, moving back to Maine, I remember sitting with the pastor that I had worked for at the time, and he was like, well, maybe I could hire you part-time to do this. And I thought, no, like, I know I can't come back. Like, I just knew that that wasn't in the cards for me, and that that's not where I was supposed to be. But at the same time of not knowing where I was supposed to be and kind of grieving, like, well, I thought full-time ministry was where I was headed and leading, and that's weird that that's not a thing anymore that I've known this whole time. But falling into something better, right, and greater, and things like that. So I think that was probably the first time I had experienced grief, was letting go of something that was so familiar to me that I really enjoyed doing. But I knew that that season was wrapping up, and the program that I was working in wasn't going to go much longer. And it didn't. And so, and that was hard, until, because I put my life into that, and my heart and soul was into that. And I really enjoyed it. But so that was probably the first time I experienced grief. And then I think there have been like pockets of grief throughout all of my adulthood. Um, watching your friends get married in your 30s and then having children. Oh boy. And being the friend that's not. Yeah, you like definitely feel that. And there have been times that I look at my life and I'm like, what am I doing wrong? Where is that? And those are just like huge parts of grief pockets that you walk through. And maybe I'm more emotional about it today than I thought that I would be talking about it. But yeah, so I think that for me has been, over the past probably 5 years, a real reality of grief. And with that has come like a little bit of divide in friendships, because they have kids and their lives are changing and they're doing their thing with their families. And you kind of just fit in the pocket of it when there's availability. And so sometimes that's hard, like coming to grips with that. So that's like one of them that hits over the years, right? And then even more recently, switching jobs and things like that. Again, another situation where I thought I'm going to retire with this company and having to grieve, like putting in almost 11 years and feeling like, oh, there's really nowhere else for me to go. And the best thing for me is to do this, but grieving the comfortability and the security, it kind of felt like, and starting something new. So I think that those are like pockets of grief that I wanted to touch on, because I think that they can be important to realize that it's okay to grieve where you're not at, where you thought that you would be, where everybody else around you is and you're not, and being okay with that, and knowing that like, just because you aren't where you thought you would be at any age, like it doesn't take less value away from what you have to offer in this world. But it's really, really easy. I remember probably about 5 years ago, someone said to me, I feel like people who work in ministry, we were having a conversation about their relationship with the Lord and them serving at the church and stuff like that, that they were attending at the time. And I asked the question, why do you feel so pressed that you have to be there all the time? And their response was, I feel like when you're working in ministry, you have a closer relationship with the Lord, and that brings you closer. And I thought, no, because there's a lot of people working in ministry these days who have no relationship with the Lord, and they're doing it just for the accolades and the fame, or just to be on the stage or whatever. But your relationship with the Lord isn't dependent on where you stand on the stage, outside of
On
the
the stage,
stage,
right?
where you are, right? And I use that example only because that really hit me at that time, that again, 5 years ago. So I was 36. No, that's only 3 years. I don't know. I was like 34. And so I remember just thinking like, my life, just because I don't stand in the spaces that I longed to stand in, didn't mean that I was less of a woman for where I stand today. And that lesson, having that conversation with that person, it hurt a little bit, right? Because I'm like, well, I don't work in ministry. What do you think about me? It was my first thought,
Sure.
and, but okay. But also, like, I've carried that lesson with me for the past 5 years, because just because where I stand today doesn't take away the value of everything I've worked for to get to where I'm at. And so if I sat down and had that conversation with my younger self, I would say, you're going to be so proud of how far you've come. You didn't get married when you thought you would. You don't have children right now, but you would be so proud of how you moved so far away from home when at 10 years old you could barely stay the night at someone else's house. You would be so proud of the career that you have. You would be so proud that you left a job that was no longer serving you for something that's going to elevate you. Like, I think that it's so important just to stop, pause, and be so proud of where you are when you're having those moments of grief. That's my pedestal. I'll step off now.
No, I think you made some really valid and very important points, because if we would have known those things when we were in our late 20s, mid 20s, early 30s, going into those seasons of life, I think that our perspectives might have been a little bit different had we just had a little bit of insight. And now I say that, and I also understand that part of the process and the journey is learning it, right? Like, you have to learn it for yourself. But
Right.
I think it would have been helpful to at least have had a heads up, like, hey, you're going to hit some hard times that are going to knock you off your feet. And it's okay. You're still going to get back up, but don't beat yourself up because you fell down. And you just have so much wisdom. And so I'm really grateful for your perspective on that, because, you know, I've also had pockets as an adult in my, well, I would say it's my 30s. My 30s seem to be a bit rougher than my 20s were. Um, and so,
Same.
um, not to say that there isn't great in all of them, but it's still hard. Um,
Mm-hmm.
but the things that I've learned, you touched on something that made me think about how, when you were talking about that conversation with your friend who um, said that ministry means that you're closer to the Lord. And if I've learned anything in the last 5 years of my life, it's how quickly we can use the ministry or those kinds of positions to feel like we're closer to the Lord. But that does not mean that your heart is where it needs to be. And learning that for myself and having to like come to terms with, oh, I think I was doing this just because I got used to what it is like to work in this kind of environment, because I've been doing it for half of my life at this point, that I had to get back to the basics of, I need the Lord. I need Jesus to help me walk through this. I need to focus on who he is and not what I'm doing for like the sake of the ministry, because that doesn't equate to the same thing as a relationship with the Lord. And I'm grateful that God in his mercy will show us those moments. But it is a hard lesson to learn at the same time, because when you think that you're doing okay in this one direction and you realize, wait, my motivation is not right and my walk with the Lord is not okay, um, that can be alarming. But all of that to say, I think if I were to look back, I don't regret any of those things that I walked through. I mean, it brought me to where I am now, and I wouldn't be who I am now if it wasn't for those moments. And I think it's just important that we, like you said, look at the things that we can be proud of that we learned, and so that it doesn't become an overwhelming thought of, look at what I lost.
Yeah. Yeah. I think when we start thinking about grief in life, I think it's a little bit different. And you said this on our last episode, that it's not linear, right? And that there's always the ebbs and flows. And I think when we look at grief in life, it's the same concept, that it's not linear, but we don't have to grieve it in the same way as if we lost somebody. Grief when we lose somebody eventually, hopefully, becomes kind of a sweet memory as we remember them and we sit with our grief. But or we sit with our sadness and we just feel sad because they're not sitting next to us. But I think that when we're grieving in life and we're grieving what we wish life looked like, it's important to stop ourselves and find that place of, it doesn't look like where I expected it to be, but I have all of these other things that are going really well. And maybe you're sitting in that moment and you're like, Lindsay, nothing's going well right now, actually. Everything is terrible. Been there, had that too. So, on the flip side of that,
Same.
maybe you're in that space and you're just like, I need to grieve this and I need to figure out how to get out of it. And that's, I think, where your tribe comes in with people and finding your community. Um, and finding those women or those men, those people that are there to say, okay, well, how can we help you get out of this? Like, I
Mhm.
see you, I hear you, I know you're hurting, I know you're grieving, but how do I pick you up? How can I carry you the next couple of steps? And maybe it's just simply them pouring into your life and speaking validation over you, letting you know how amazing you actually are at who you are, right? Because it's not about the works that we put in, it's not about the actions that we do on a daily basis, but having someone be like, you show up even whenever you're stressed or broken or beaten down. You always are there for the phone calls, or you show love and kindness when the world's not being so kind to you. Like having those people just to encourage you with words of encouragement or just sit with you on the couch and eat a tub of ice cream with you if that's what you need. Like there are just those moments that it's okay to grieve, but make an action plan. Okay, life is beating me down. What next? Right? And there were so many times in my life, like I am not proud of some of the stories that I could tell you about trying to get out of small town Palaca and the things that I did that I look back at and I'm like, wow, I was really an immature teenager. But one thing that I am so proud of is that, you know, at 20 years old, I was like, no more, cut, done, and fought to move to a Bible school in New Hampshire where I knew nobody, except for the directors who worked at my church when I was 15 and I barely remembered them. I just put in a Google search master's commission because a friend was going and I thought, I'm going to do that too. And she was going to one in Florida. And I was like, nope, too close to home and packed my bags and went north. But I'm so thankful for that. And I think like it was an action plan. I was so determined to get out. And I remember my mom saying, you'll last 3 weeks. Well,
Wow.
here we are.
Yeah.
19 years later, and we're still going. uh,
And I'm so
um,
glad too.
but those those are the times, like I'll say it again, when you're down and you're just grieving where life has brought you and you just feel like everything around you is unfair, make an action plan. What do you want the next 3 months of this year to look like? When we're
Mm.
recording this, it's October 5th. When we release it, it's going to be October 7th. And you have 3 months. What can you do in the next 3 months that in January you're looking back and going, wow, I'm so proud of myself for how I handled those 3 months?
And I would say, I would just only add, like, be willing to listen to the people that are trying to speak that into you, right? Like,
Mhm.
there was a season of my life that was really dark, and I was allowing what other people were saying to really affect me. And I was in a very dark place, and I'd never felt so much anger in my life as I did during the season. And it was pretty bad. Like, it was starting to spill over into my conversations and spill over into how I treated other people. And finally, somebody said to my husband, "Is she okay?" Like, I'm really starting to get worried because
Mm.
that's not how she usually is. And it was that like kind of put me in check to be like, wait a second, I can't live like this. Like, I don't want to be known as an angry person that's just bitter and angry at the world. Like, that's not my personality. That's not who I am. That's not who I strive to be. But I was allowing these situations to kind of affect me that way. But allowing someone to speak into my life was what I needed in those moments to like course correct and figure out, all right, this isn't a great place. I don't like where I am. I don't like what's being said. I have zero control out of any of this, but I can control how I respond. And I need to fix how I'm responding because this isn't okay. And I just think that if we're willing to acknowledge that and course correct, then it can be used in the positive no matter what's happening, because there's so much of life that happens that is outside of our control. We can't control what other people say about us. We can't control the timeline of life that we want to be on, but we can control how we respond to it, and allowing those things to grow and help us become better rather than bitter is really important.
That's so true. And I think, you said it best, like somebody coming to your husband is what it took. I think that when we start listening to the conversations that we're having and we continually make ourselves aware of who we're having those conversations with and how we feel when we walk away from them. We've talked about it before, but what table are you sitting at? Because when you're sitting in that place of grief and nothing feels right, nothing feels like it's going the way that you planned it. And like you said, there's no timeline to life. Like life is going to be life and God's going to do what he does. And we're on his timeline. And sometimes
Right.
it doesn't feel great and you may be questioning it, but surrounding yourself with the people who are speaking positively into your life, and when they hear the negativity coming out of you, redirect it into a positive. I don't like myself. Why don't you like yourself? And start drawing those things out of you, as opposed to the people who are just validating your anger or validating your frustration. You're going to feel so different based on the conversations and the tables that you're sitting at during that season.
For sure. So this has been a great conversation. I'm really glad we've been able to talk about this. We'll jump back in next week with more around this topic. But if you've been encouraged or challenged, drop us a comment, like and subscribe where you listen, because we would love to hear from you.
That's a wrap on this episode of Two Main Friends in a Podcast. Follow us on Facebook or Instagram. You can also send us an email at twomainfriends@gmail.com. And as always, leave us a review wherever you're listening.